Even though the devastating Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed nearly 2% of Africa's population within 6 months, there has been very limited investigation of this catastrophe, especially in Franco and Lusophone Africa. This story provides the first continent-wide overview of the disaster, though it concentrates on the worst-hit sub-Saharan region. Welcome to the Did You Know segment with me, your host Espila Caleb, and this is the story of the Spanish flu in Africa. Of all 6 continents, Africa and particularly sub-Saharan Africa suffered the highest average mortality rate in the pandemic. On the causative H1N1 influenza virus, its possible evolution and the highly infectious and life-threatening character of the pandemic led to the entry referred to as the pandemic with 3 distinct but related waves. An infectious but relatively mild first wave in March to July 1918, the deadly second wave of August to December 1918, and a serious but more moderate third wave in 1919. In the case of Africa, only North Africa and belatedly a corner of Southeast Africa appear to have experienced the first wave. This means that unlike the Americas, Europe and Asia, all of which were swept by the first wave, most of sub-Saharan Africa's initial exposure to the pandemic was to the lethal second wave. This means that unlike the Americas, Europe and Asia, all of which were swept by the first wave, most of sub-Saharan African initial exposure to the pandemic was to the lethal second wave. The corollary of this was that the bulk of its population, unlike most of other inhabitants of the world, had no opportunity to contract the first wave Spanish flu and thereby develop a degree of immunity to its far deadlier successor a few months later. They were therefore hit by full unmitigated forces of the pandemic's second wave, and it showed. The only Africans to escape this onslaught, at least partially, were those living in the 2 regions of Africa touched by the first wave, that is North Africa, Maghreb and Egypt, and Southeast Africa, especially South Africa's natal province and adjoining territories. The impact of the lethal second wave in these regions was marked highly by those that are lightly. The impact of the lethal second wave in these regions was markedly lighter than elsewhere on the continent, presumably because of their inhabitants' prior immunizing exposure to the first wave. Certainly, some contemporaries believed that this could be the case and explained the difference as arising from where in Africa the epidemic had commenced. For example, in one district in southern Rhodesia, locals distinguished between a less severe strain of the disease emanating from Natal and a more severely form of the same from Cape Town. Their gendered worldview led them to label the former as the female version and the latter as the male version. Alas, for the majority of Africans, it was the male form of the Spanish flu that they first encountered. Between mid-August and late September 1918, the virulent second wave entered sub-Saharan Africa through 3 of its war-swollen seaports: Freetown, Cape Town, and Mombasa. In each case, war-related factors played a significant role. To Freetown, the virus came from England aboard a Royal Navy warship on which it had begun to rage through the voyage south. By the time this vessel docked in Freetown on 14th August 1918, 124 of its crew had been laid low. Nonetheless, it was not placed under strict quarantine, probably because the civilian authorities there were reluctant to disrupt naval operations. Colliers were therefore permitted on board to load coal, while medical staff from other warships came over to help out in its sick bay. The result was that within days, the port colliers and dock laborers were going down with Spanish flu like 9 pins, as were sailors aboard the other warships. From them, it quickly spread to Freetown's general population, 70% of whom was stricken within a fortnight, describing a situation that was to become common throughout Africa in the coming weeks. The governor got to report that the disease spread with devastating rapidity, disorganizing everything. Everybody was attacked almost at once. The infection of Cape Town and the interior stemmed directly from Freetown. 2 troop ships transporting South African Native Labour Corps troops home from Europe had stopped in Freetown to coal at the height of the outbreak. No sooner did they leave the port than cases of Spanish flu began to appear on board. This prompted the health authorities in Cape Town to hospitalize those who were still sick when the ships tied up there in September 1918, and to confine the remaining soldiers to a military camp for 2 days under less than rigid quarantine. When none showed the symptoms of influenza, they were formally demobilized and allowed to embark on trains for their homes all over the country. The next day, cases of Spanish influenza appeared among the staff of the military camp and the transport unit that had conveyed the troops there, among the hospital staff, and among Steve Doers and the fishermen working in the harbor. Whether the ship from India that is reported to have brought the Spanish flu to the third African port to entry, Mombasa, late September 1918 had a military connection too is unclear. However, what is known is that the disease was soon prevalent among the Kenyan carrier corps, who fanned out from the port across Kenya on being demobilized. As they traveled up country, so did the gathering epidemic, sweeping through the country via rail and road and river. A similar pattern of infection is evident in Tanganyikan coast, inland, and from Nyasaland, etc. A King African Rifles regiment marching along this route to be demobilized strewed the road with dead and dying, an official on the spot reportedly grimacing. Thus did the influenza virus spread to a greater or lesser extent throughout sub-Saharan Africa in the last quarter of 1918. From these 3 ports, which had become veritable nodes of infection for the continent, the pandemic spread across and along the coast and far inland, engulfing community after community. Prime vectors on land were newly demobilized soldiers and carriers/porters. Thus did the influenza virus spread to a greater or lesser extent throughout sub-Saharan Africa in the last quarter of 1918. From these 3 ports, which had become veritable nodes of infection for the continent, the pandemic spread along the coast and far inland, engulfing community after community. Prime vectors of land were newly demobilized soldiers and carriers/porters, families fleeing infected towns for their lives, and railway personnel and migrant workers. Prime vectors on land were newly demobilized soldiers and carriers or porters, families fleeing infected towns for their lives, and railway personnel and migrant workers desperate to escape from mine compounds and barracks where death was rampant. In Kimberley, for example, thousands of diamond miners made up their minds to leave as if the bears, the mine owners, did not agree. They insisted they would break out, even if fired upon. Reportedly, a panicky labor agent, while an official in Northern Rhodesia recalled the pell-mell flight from many labor centers and the natural reluctance to return to what were regarded as centers of infection. Within 3 months of its arrival by sea, therefore, the H1N1 influenza virus was causing death and mayhem even deep in the interior of West, Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa, thanks to the ubiquity of flu-infected men on the move. As one historian recognized, it was as if the colonial transportation network had been planned in preparation for the pandemic, allowing the latter to ravage the continent far and wide, from Dakar to Mombasa and from Cape Town to the Congo. Paralysis and disruption. Paralysis, or at very least acute disruption of all routine activities, followed in the wake of the pandemic as it struck down person after person, family after family. In many towns and villages, shops, banks, and businesses struggled to remain open for want of staff. Public transport, schooling, church services, and court proceedings were curtailed. Mines, factories, and workshops suspended operations. Even the provision of basic services like sanitary removal, mail delivery, and policing faltered. Cape Town's main streets are almost deserted in the middle of the day, noted an awed journalist. Business has become quite a secondary consideration, and sightseeing and amusements have lost all attractions. Cape Town is like a city of mourning, and nothing is talked of or thought about other than influenza. In Accra, a doctor described similar scenes: the suspension of public businesses, the paralysis of trade, indeed the almost entire cessation of all activities save those connected with the care of the sick and the disposal of the dead. In Addis Ababa, it looked like a dead city, remembered a long-time resident. A shutdown which extended even to the government, Abyssinian government, utterly disorganized as a result of the influenza epidemic. A British diplomat telegraphed home. According to an Italian minister, it was no longer possible to regard Abyssinian government as a serious organization with which the powers can satisfactorily treat. In rural areas, tilling, planting, and harvesting came to a halt, and cows were left unmilked because whole households lay sick or dying in their houses. For 2 or 3 weeks, a great solemn hush has been prevailed, wrote a rural resident of South Africa about his surroundings. No one to be seen, no one to be heard, no life in the farms, no work in the lands. Lord Influenza and his followers have the countrywide in their grip, for exactly the same reason as an agricultural officer in rural Sierra Leone explained. There were very few pits or fit persons to scare away birds, which consequently took their tithe of their crop. A small settlement in northern Gold Coast resembled a deserted village. One sees no one, observed a passing official. Nor was this temporary paralysis of the agricultural cycle without medium-term consequences, for in East and Southeast Africa, it coincided with planting time because fit labor was now in even shorter supply. Less seed was sown, producing a much diminished harvest in 1919, and consequently famine or near-famine conditions. The death from starvation which resulted, as well as the increased flow of migrant laborers to town. Desperate for income to buy food for their hungry families were two of the many less obvious knock-on effects of the pandemic. Another was the introduction of quick-growing varieties of maize and beans in a bid to prevent a second famine, while for a similar reason, in southern Nigeria, peasants switched to the planting cassava rather than yams as the staple crop, as the former required less labor to cultivate and could be sown and harvested all year round. The speed with which cassava appeared in 1919 and 1920 in fields previously devoted to yams may be regarded pandemic, concluded a historian. Countermeasures. Medical and administrative authorities were overwhelmed by the withering force of the epidemic and the pandemic, as there was no medical antidote to influenza or its complications at the time. The best that the doctors could prescribe was either palliative or supportive or natural recovery and good nursing. As usual, in the absence of a sure biomedical cure, quack remedies proliferated to meet the anguished popular demand of an antidote. For their part, where they had sufficient resources, government acted in accordance with the advice of their experts. In such matters, their medical offers, they distributed leaflets containing hints on prevention and treatment of Spanish flu, opened emergency hospitals, supplied hastily concocted vaccines and special flu mixtures to the public, organized home visits to provide food and succor to the sick, and dispatched to the worst hit areas those army doctors and nurses who could be spared. In a very few cases where the situation was extremely dire, for instance in Kimberley, Windhoek and Port Louis, they divided towns into fixed medical districts and allocated one doctor to each to treat all the sick there. Irrespective of who their usual doctor was, however, in most places no such targeted relief was available, especially in rural areas where most Africans lived, and families and individuals were left to fend for themselves if their surrounding community was itself too stricken to assist. In this inauspicious situation, most resorted to traditional herbal or folk remedies, practices and deterrents like wearing amulets, sprinkling multi-traditional medicine on approach roads, or hanging charms on doors. However, these are usually proved as ineffective, and biomedical treatment that anyway was still viewed with suspicion by many Africans because of its association with the apparatus of colonialism. In southern Rhodesia, for example, many locals ran away and hid when they heard anyone who was near administering medicine, while in South Africa, an Anglican bishop and his team of relief workers found the people simply would not have us. One stood outside his hut and insisted his child was better. Another woman took out medicine but said we had come to poison them. The toll. In these grim circumstances, death soared. Southern Rhodesia's medical director described how people were numbed and staggered with the immensity of the disaster, prompting fears across the continent that entire populations might be destroyed. In rural Gold Coast, for example, villagers wondered if this is the end of the world, while a black South African believed that the diseases threatened the existence of the entire race. In Cape Town, a prominent financier was shaken by the reply of a senior government health worker to his question as to whether the city's population was going to be wiped out. He was told by the doctor, "For the first time in my life, I am panicky, and I believe we are indeed in towns like Kimberley, Addis Ababa, Port Louis, Windhoek, Ilroin, Sekondi, Bloemfontein, and Bathurst, all of which lost over 4% of their populations to Spanish flu. Such as cataclysmic outcome must have seemed possible, with deaths topping 300 per day in Kimberley at the height of the epidemic. A contemporary calculated that at that rate, in 16 months, no one will be left alive in the city. Although the statistics for Spanish flu mortality in Africa by whole countries are very inexact, the worst hit states appear to have been those where three features came together. First, exposure to the pandemic, only in which the most virulent second wave form, being part of an extensive transport network by sea or by land, being regularly transferred by large numbers of people on the move, such as soldiers, sailors, and migrant soldiers. That all the three features coincided most fully in countries like South Africa, Kenya, Cameroon, Gold Coast, Gambia, Tanganyika, and Nyasaland, and these appear to have sustained the highest flu mortality. More than 5% of their population is unlikely to be coincidental. Nor is it likely to be coincidental that flu mortality in North Africa, where the toxic trio of features was not simultaneously present, probably did not rise above 1% of the population. Significant differences in mortality across the continent notwithstanding, it is estimated that in total, the pandemic carried off 2.4 million Africans, about 1.8% of the continent's population. Of these, 2.2 million were sub-Saharan African, where the mortality rate was 2.3% overall. Since, as elsewhere in the world, the bulk of those who died were young adults between 18 and 40, the effect on society was disastrous in terms of loss of labor, reproductive capacity, parents, breadwinners, and family structures. For the continent, it has a sudden demographic, social, and economic catastrophe. Conclusion. In sum, the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 left an indelible mark on the demographic, social, economic, medical, cultural, psychological, religious, and spiritual character of sub-Saharan Africa for at least one generation in territories as far apart as Nigeria, Kenya, Southwest Africa, and South Africa. Its dire memory remained stamped on the names given to the age sets and individuals between 1918 and 1919, and even to those years themselves. Indeed, for the rest of the 20th century, it became a popular means of dating other events as happening before or after the flu. In the somber recollection of one old man in 1973, 1918 was the year when God was angry. That was it, folks. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you like this content, leave a comment below. And remember, we'll be doing this each and every Wednesday. Next, we are going to do a very interesting topic still on Africa. Keep it locked only on R&I TV. My name is Espila Caleb. See you next time.